Today, I'm going to talk to you about return on investment for automated testing, test automation with software, and what an important field it's become for a lot of people in the industry, even people who never thought they would have to encounter testing or do testing. But I've been in the industry for a long time, as you'll see, and I wanted to talk to you today about how you can get an idea of how to measure the ROI and make sure that you're on the right track with test automation. Now, my name is Marcus Merrill. I'm the Senior Director of Technology Strategy at Sauce Labs, and I've been involved with Selenium conference planning as well as Selenium project leadership for many, many years now, and I'm intimately familiar with the tool Selenium and what it does for web testing. And now what I'm trying to do at Sauce Labs as the head of technology strategy is expand Sauce's capabilities to go beyond Selenium, both earlier and later in development cycles, from functional testing to now API testing, as well as mobile testing, beta testing, and production monitoring as we move throughout the software development lifecycle. It's important to understand that Selenium takes up the same amount of space in the process, but that it's no longer the only focus that you should have when you're doing test automation. I've been doing testing in general for 20 years, and in my spare time, I deal with robots a lot as a hobby, as well as family music, and lately a whole lot of video games, kind of a scary amount, but I hear that's going on during the pandemic quite a bit. So let's understand what we mean when we say ROI. And then let's talk about some baseline assertions, assumptions that people make when talking about return on investment for test automation. Then we're going to talk about a new concept we're pushing here called the Devops test toolchain, which seeks to incorporate testing throughout the SDLC and let you understand where you are in the process and what kinds of checks you can put in place that will help you ensure that you can be confident about what you're delivering to your customers. Finally, we'll talk about the shift left and shift right concepts that we've all been talking about lately. And I'll try to make a case that these aren't just buzzwords, but that they're actually really, really important concepts in dealing with testing and thinking about how you can approach it from various different directions. So first of all, let's talk about ROI in general and what the sort of warning signs that we can look at to find out whether or not we're sort of veering off course, even if we can't precisely measure what kind of return on investment we're getting. So one thing that I noticed when I was starting to undertake a project to build an ROI calculator for Sauce Labs is that when you Google this, you find out that return on investment, mostly people think, how much money can I save through test automation? How much money can I save? And maybe how much time can I save? How many fewer people can I have on my project if I do automated testing? And I'm going to make the case that that's not a good and broad enough perspective to bring to the question itself. I think that return on investment has a lot more to do with team cohesiveness and productivity and efficiency than it does with purely cost. It's not just a numbers game here. It also has to do with how many defect escapes you have with test automation versus without test automation. And there's a very classic graph that people show all the time about how early you catch a defect and its correlating cost to the organization. And it's a pretty well studied metric at this point that if you catch something at the unit test phase, it's far cheaper than if you catch it in production phase. And so being customers of Sumo Logic, of course, you can identify with this very well. It also impacts user experience and how well your users are able to move through your product and whether or not they're able to accomplish their tasks that they wanted to. It also helps you with mean time to release, release frequency. This is one of the DORA metrics that I think that we all ought to be considering. And when you have test automation in place, in all the right places with all the right coverage, you can release more frequently, more confidently than you could before. And then be assured that you have reliability after you go into production, especially if you do really good APM monitoring, as well as A/B testing, canary releases, and feature flagging, as a lot of organizations are really trying to adopt in the new world of DevOps. Finally, the most important thing to me is user behavior feedback loops, where you get to see how people are using your product in action, in real time, in production. And tying this back into test automation, using it as a check to serve about measuring the effectiveness of your test automation, as well as bringing environmental concerns to bear on whether or not your test automation is good. These things are fundamentally important for measuring the return on investment that you're getting. It's not always just dollars. It is frequently time and confidence. So Let me give you a few warning signs that you should look out for to tell you whether or not your test automation is successful or not successful. And some things just to watch out for. A lot of people approach test automation thinking that there are 15 tests that my manual tester will do when we're about to release some software. Well, I will just automate those 15 tests and then boom, we have automation and we are now successful. What they don't account for most of the time is that, first of all, tests that are done by humans tend to be a lot longer, many steps, whereas tests should be more discrete and smaller, more granular, as well as the fact that human testers are usually accounting for dozens, if not hundreds of variables when they move throughout a test, that it would be virtually impossible to teach the computer how to watch for all of those various things. Computers also can't really evaluate whether or not software is good or not. That's what the human should be doing. The computer should just be telling you whether there was an unexpected change or an unexpected state in the software when it executed this particular set of steps. Simple tests are preferred over complex tests for computers. We want tests to be a couple of steps to set up, one step ideally for an action to take or one group of steps, and then some sort of assertion to find out whether or not it worked. That's what an automated test should be. 3 steps: set up, execute, judge, and then send the results back to something else that can do the evaluation, the analysis on the overall state of the product. Now, tests should also be done at the lowest layer that will deliver value. What I see a lot is people using Selenium in ways that they really should be breaking their tests up into API tests or unit tests even, where people are overusing Selenium to test business logic flows throughout the user interface. Selenium testing should be limited to determining whether or not the user interface is capable of rendering the outputs of an API, not testing the API itself. For testing the API itself, you should do API testing, which is not only faster, but it cuts out the browser and the middle layer, and a whole lot of things get in the way between you and the software itself. Finally, I think you should test what the money wants. I once had a team that spent over 2 weeks automating test after test after test to find out whether or not they could edit the user profile properly in the way it was intended to do. And over lunch, I had sat with someone from the business intelligence area who told me that fewer than 0.5% of users ever go to those pages whatsoever. And I had just spent 2 weeks having a team spend all this time automating those particular things and adding essentially no value, because we should have been testing the stuff that actually produces revenue. So just having more testing isn't itself a good thing. Having valuable testing that is executed quickly, stably, and gives you clear signal is the priority. Now, here's things to watch out for that will definitely cost you money and time and all the metrics that we talked about. If you allow a lot of failing tests, and I know there are teams all over who tolerate high failures of Selenium tests, and these failing tests often go unexamined, unanalyzed. Flaky tests, you don't know if it's going to pass one time or the next due to network constraints or environmental concerns, anything like that. Very difficult to be able to say that you're getting value out of those. Same with poorly documented tests. If you don't understand what a test is doing and can't figure it out quickly, how can you actually stand up and say, I have covered this area with my automated tests? Tests that haven't been looked at in a long time, are you sure they're doing what they need to be doing anymore? Because your software is constantly changing. The test should be changing with it. Tests that can't fail. I'll tell another story. I was working on a software project at one point where we had 800 Selenium tests going, and the site went down. And I didn't turn off the trigger that kicks off the automated tests. And so I got an email from my boss at one point. It said, how is it that 38 tests still passed when the site was down? Turns out we couldn't trust those 38 tests, but we didn't know that. They couldn't fail. I still have no idea how that happened. Now, testing at the wrong layer, I've already covered this. It's a very rickety thing to have your user interface tests that takes so long to run and require so many different variables between you and the software to be able to try to go through and test complicated business flows when you could just be doing that at the API layer much more quickly, much more stably. The problem with these things, and the reason I say that these give negative value, not return on investment, is that they give you the idea that you have coverage in a particular area when in fact you don't. They're worse than zero It's not that you're not giving coverage, it's that you're projecting to the organization that you're giving coverage, but in fact, you are not. And that's very, very dangerous to fall into. That's how you lose trust from your organization over time. And here's another thing. I'm going to go through these rather quickly. Not all passing tests add value. My example earlier about user profile. Test results need to be analyzed. Without analysis, how can you say that you're getting any return on any investment in automated testing? Tests that don't add measurable coverage aren't adding value either. So how do we move towards better ROI and better DORA metrics using test automation? First of all, we start with measuring cost and time. I said that this is probably the wrong way to go, but the truth is, I don't think you can actually start this process without starting at cost and time. You can't move through this without at least understanding what your baseline is. How much time does it take to execute a test manually? How many tests are there? How long does it take for me to execute an entire suite before I release? And then when you combine that with maintenance and development of these automated tests and say it takes me this long to automate one test, and then I never have to worry about it again, or I have to worry about it 15% of the time for a maintenance cost, then these factors start to complicate things, but they also start to give you a much clearer picture. Because if you're just measuring cost and time, you might be very tempted to say 800 tests, I'm saving $1 million a year. So if I had 1,600 tests, I would save $2 million a year. And that's just not true usually, because twice the number of tests may not give you any meaningful, valuable coverage. And they do definitely add maintenance cost and time. So team productivity is the next thing. Is there an increase in velocity and cycle time between before I implemented my automated tests and after? Production defect mitigation. Am I reducing the number of defects I ship after introducing test automation? And along that curve, when I introduce them, how is it reducing my cost of defects later? Automation across the DevOps test toolchain, which I'll talk about in just a minute, is very important because it ties together lots of different signals that are currently siloed between requirements gathering product, developers, testers, business intelligence, DevOps, everyone along the chain that typically don't talk to each other. The DevOps test toolchain is seeking to allow those teams to collaborate with each other and see clear signal about what's going on inside their software before and after you ship. Finally, it gets us to transformative delivery confidence, which is the idea that once you ship your software, you know that there's a very, very, very small chance that anything could go wrong. Why? Because you've done everything you could at the proper layers through the automation to hold everything in place to make sure that you are confident in shipping it to market. So let's talk about the DevOps test toolchain. Currently, this is what DevOps looks like at the moment. And what companies are trying to do, we see this all the time at Sauce Labs. Companies are trying to tie all sorts of different products together. They're trying to get signals out of one and feed them into another. They're trying to tie together disparate signals and make API calls from one thing to the next that's going to actually bring everything together. What we're trying to do here is unite a set of metrics around testing specifically and feed those into other systems like Sumo Logic and get signal from other systems like Sumo Logic in order to be able to correlate signals and show the tester what they're missing when software gets into the test environment. Once they get into production, what have we not tested? Are we seeing errors happening in production within seconds of deployment right now when it used to take us 4 days of just getting a user report? There's a fun metric I'd like to try to introduce because I'm such a gamer around the amount of time it takes to see the amount of time you have before a Reddit post gets posted about how bad a game is or something like that. When in fact, if you had found this defect much earlier, it would have shown up and you could have avoided having a Reddit post. I like to say that it takes a lot less time to write a unit test for you to write a unit test than it takes for someone else to write a Reddit post. And this is where I want to try to get more into delivery confidence. Shifting left and shifting right, people talk about them being buzzwords. In truth, they're very, very vital concepts within testing right now. What it means is testing earlier and testing later without necessarily telling developers they have to write Selenium tests. I feel like that's probably a bad idea. Developers should be writing unit tests, but developers should also be handing off a lot of testing activity to the user themselves by adding things like canary builds cycling in 2% of traffic onto a new change so that they know whether or not the users are having a bad time immediately. And if the blast radius can be reduced so much by saying only 2% of users are seeing this at any given point, therefore, we're going to be able to pull this out of production and re-roll it and rework on it and make sure that when we get back out, then everything is going to be fine. Because we know poor engagement on mobile apps can destroy an app upon a bad launch. There's a very famous video game example that I won't name that came out within the last year that very nearly destroyed the company when it came out because the release was creaky, let's say. It was it had a lot of defects, and there was people were not able to play the game online very well or get through the game in its entirety, even in single player. What I really encourage is separating this out by vertical. What's true for healthcare may not be true for what's for financial. What's true for gaming certainly won't be true for e-commerce. And as testing moves into production with all these things, it's more important than ever to keep testing fast, nimble, reliable. This is why you want to keep an eye on DORA metrics and correlate your Sumo logic signals with what's going on in your test environment using the Devops test toolchain that we're constructing. So in conclusion, most people will never know the org-wide power, the power of org-wide delivery confidence. Once you've lived through it, you can't let it go. If you center your work around the risks and not just around coverage, then you'll make the right decisions. And this won't happen overnight, of course. It takes years for most. Not everyone can be a FANG company overnight. And we are hoping to spread the word here at SauceMax. So let's do this. I appreciate your time today. I appreciate Sumo Logic hosting me, and I hope everyone can nail this just as thoroughly as we want them to. Thank you.